Hello and welcome back to Marketing Realities for 2019. Kevin Gray and I put together this podcast on a regular basis where we try to talk to some people that are experts in various aspects of market research and its effect on marketing from around the world as we try to understand what's current, what's happening, and what we should be thinking about to make ourselves maybe more professional and to make your market research and your involvement in market research a little bit better. We've got a really exciting guest today who Kevin is going to introduce us to.
Hi, I'm Kevin Gray. Betty Adamou is our guest. We're very, very fortunate to have her early in the morning London time or UK time. And I think, thanks so much for joining us today. And the weather out here is a lot nicer than I think what you're experiencing. But anyway, thanks again for coming. And
thank you. And Happy New Year to you both as well.
Yeah. And so could you just very briefly, I think a lot of people, you're a celebrity in marketing research, if there is such a thing, but could you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us, whatever background you want to and what you do, and then tell us about gamification.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'm Betty Adamou. I'm the founder of Research Through Gaming, which is based here in the UK, where I am at the moment this morning, but we do have clients all around the world. And I've been running Research Through Gaming now for just over 8 years, so it's been a fair while. And Research Through Gaming really have a mix of working with direct with brands, which are in the majority Fortune 500 companies, and where I work on a consultative basis with market research companies. So I will very often speak to some of the bigger market research agencies and the smaller ones to help them gamify or make serious games from some of the research projects that they have with their own clients. So that's a little bit about me and Research Through Gaming there. And I'm also an author. I wrote Games and Gamification Market Research. It took about 1.5 years to write, but was kind of 3 years in the making. And finally, it's out there. It was released not that long ago, just a few months ago in November 2018. And as far as I know, it's doing very well. Last time I checked, about 2 or 3 weeks after it was published, it already sold about 200 copies, which was a surprise to me because I just thought, this is a really niche area. So, we'll see how well it goes later on. And people have been very kind, posting photos of themselves on Twitter and LinkedIn, reading the book or opening it or dancing with it. So that's been great. And Games and Gamification Market Research is all about what is gamification, and how can we use it in market research, and actually what are the big differences between making your research as a fully fledged game or gamifying maybe an existing survey or indeed a focus group or any other type of research methodology you might have. So I think, from here, Kevin, you asked me what gamification is. Broadly, gamification, the definition of it is quite widely contested, but the most kind of used definition is using game elements and game mechanics for non-game context. Now, that definition, I think for a newbie, right, is probably a little bit confusing if you don't know what a game mechanic is or a game element, right? So my preferred definition that I've written in the book is gamification is the repurposing of games to create the kind of engagement that we see in games, but for things that aren't originally games. Okay, so we see the gamification in learning languages. Now, there's apps like Duolingo, for example, that gamify the experience, which is just basically saying, they're trying to make the process of doing whatever the task is more playful and more intrinsically engaging, right? So that basically we can get things done, right? That we know that we need to get done, or learning a new process. Gamification is used in employee training. It's used in the medical industry. Literally, there is not a single industry where gamification is not being used, and it's set to be worth $1.6 billion by the year 2020. So it's not just that it's everywhere, but also that it's a growing area as well. Okay, so that's gamification. And because it's been applied in so many industries and disciplines, using it in market research is really a no-brainer, right? Because we have a lot of the same issues as researchers, because we want to make our research super engaging for people. We now have more distractions on the internet than ever before. So not only are we, competing with participants' attention for our survey, maybe versus other surveys, but we're also competing for their attention versus, them doing online shopping on Amazon, or being on Instagram, or being on Facebook, right? So it's really more important than ever that what we do with participants is really engaging, but also that intrinsic engagement and play that we get from games also has lots and lots of benefits for us as researchers, right? So really it's so the gamifying of surveys is really just a tool to get to the behaviors of intrinsic engagement and play, because those behaviors have useful outcomes for researchers. Because when we play and when we're intrinsically engaged, and this is all proven, by the way, of extensive, many decades worth of research. Play and intrinsic engagement make us more focused. They create a continuation and completion desire. We have more problem-solving abilities. We tend to have more creative ideas. And the list goes on, and there's an extensive list of these benefits in my book. And so what I say to other researchers is that making your survey as a gamified survey, or making your research as a fully fledged game, is because you want to evoke that play and intrinsic engagement to get to all those other really juicy, good outcomes, like increased focus and creating a completion desire. So that's really quite a nutshell, although I know that was quite a long one there, but I'm trying to kind of condense my quite large book into a couple of sentences there. But yeah, games and gamification are very, very different in and outside of market research. So Kevin and Dave, if you're interested about kind of fully fledged games, I'd be happy to kind of go through that as well.
Yeah, you mentioned survey a couple of times. Can this be used qualitatively too, like as part of insights communities?
Oh God, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I have seen many other researchers, probably about 3 or 4, come up, top of mind, just kind of thinking off the cuff now, who have been and are creating board games for focus groups and hall tests and things like that. But the interesting thing about this methodology, especially in the way that I use this methodology, because I create fully fledged games for research. So they're not surveys that have been gamified. They look and feel like fully fledged games. My research games have often been described as online qualitative, because it might be in a game that you are having a conversation with another character, or you're not necessarily even being asked questions, but maybe given an instruction, or you're in a certain situation or scenario. And, I can, through the way we collect the data, observe the behaviors and the outcomes that are happening in this digital world, because that's what happens in video games, right? There are so many video games now that feel that you are, having a relationship with different characters, and you're building friendships and you're having conversations, and it is in a sense very qualitative. And so very much you could apply the game-based research methods to an online sense, offline, and even a mixed bag. There's huge scope for games and gamification with kind of augmented reality, with virtual reality, and using artificial intelligence to make, you know, in-game research game characters kind of come to life.
So, you know, I know from my own experience working in advertising for decades, you know, we started 20 years ago trying to put advertising inside computer games, and now we sort of see a whole bunch of stuff. So, you know, if you think about Fortnite and the impact Fortnite has had around the world, you know, different players of Fortnite I've talked to who are very, very involved in the discussion groups, in the, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you sometimes wonder about, they'll tell me about the fact that they're having all these discussions inside the dedicated platforms within Fortnite about stuff that's got nothing to do with the game. I mean, they'll get into conversations about, literally about what, you know, it's 3 a.m, what are you drinking to stay awake, right? Which is, you know, self-imbued. And so there's two things that I often wonder about the future of gaming and research. One is, you know, how do we actually make sure that if inside Fortnite is seen as a platform for market researchers to be doing research inside, using Fortnite as just the medium for doing research. And the second thing is, you know, market researchers using the way in which people, as you mentioned, are doing things inside existing games in order to find out what they are really thinking about things in the world, or things that are relevant to the brands, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. Well, well, there's a couple of really important points that you've brought up there, Dave, and okay, because this is a huge error. So, right, having a piece of research happening within an existing game like Fortnite, like Call of Duty, from my point of view, would be a no-no, and I'll tell you why. Because when a gamer goes to the store and buys their game, or they're streaming it online, or you know, they're acquiring it in any way, they are being prepared to play a game. And if they kind of get market researchy questions going on, that's going to create a disconnect between the expectation of the activity I'm going to take part in and actually what is going on. And the reason that I'm very sure that doesn't work is because there is an excellent case study. So we're familiar with Nintendo, right? They produced an app called Miitomo, so Miitomo, okay? And you could create an avatar yourself, or what's called a me, an MII, right? And you can have conversations with other players who are maybe your friends or family, and everybody was expecting this to be a huge success, right? It's Nintendo after all, and it was highly anticipated. But if you go online now and read about Miitomo, there are a ton of articles that talk about why it failed, because it's now no longer on the App Store, okay? And it's interesting because, and I use this as an example when I give guest lectures to students, and I use this as an example in my book, because Miitomo was doing this thing where it was randomly asking market researchy type of questions, like, do you remember the last ad you saw? What's your favorite place to go on holiday? And it would just be kind of random kind of questions like that, that would just kind of come through. And the players didn't like it. Okay, so my point of view is, if you want to create a more engaging experience, a more playful experience for your research participants, then actually creating a game that's tailored to that research, so that you're really using the game mechanics to immerse the participant in the research content, that is the best way to go. Because actually, when you're doing that, you're getting participants to think about the context of that research more. You're getting them to think about the questions maybe in a deeper way, in a more detailed way, rather than maybe, you know, using market research questions and then tacking that on to existing things.
That makes a lot of sense. And you know, I raise it because I've seen some of those examples and some of those case studies, and I guess this is one of the things where, you know, that's one end of it. I know before we came online, we were talking about, you know, other examples at the other end where, you know, people will take things like a basic survey, and because they get you to tap one of 5 smiley faces, as the answer to something. Oh, we've gamified the thing, which, you know, no, you've probably just dumbed it down or stupefied it more than anything else. But, but you know, I think that's somewhat, you know, it always strikes me when you've got that panel of 5 different smiley faces of like, okay, yeah, that's making the assumption I can't read, which I'll come back to in a minute. Maybe that is the right assumption for the future, but
yeah,
but
I mean,
it doesn't seem to me like that's actually gamifying something. That just seems to me it's like, okay, it's a different form of literacy. That's a different thing.
yeah, I mean, I would agree with you there, Dave. And actually, I heard the word surveytainment many years ago, and unfortunately, I can't remember who I heard it from first, but I used that as a category of a type of kind of research in my book. So it kind of goes surveytainment, gamification, fully fledged game in terms of like the kind of interactivity and you know, being immersed in play. But the key thing to recognize whether something is gamified or a game is to say, well, are the 4 game ingredients at play, right? And you might remember the 4 game ingredients from reading my book, but for any listeners who maybe haven't had a chance to read my book yet, the 4 game ingredients can be remembered quite easily as goals, feedback, rules, and opportunities for autonomy. Okay, so if you see those things happening in an activity, you can say, oh, that's gamified, right? And that's why apps like Duolingo, which is a gamified language learning app, work very well, because it has those 4 game ingredients. It has feedback, you have goals, you have autonomies for opportunity for autonomy, and you definitely have rules, right? And you know, Weight Watchers and all these other weight loss programs can also be described as gamification because they have those 4 rules at play, and like many loyalty cards as well. But what we need to know as researchers is to think more deeply about this, right? Because why is it important to have those 4 game ingredients? Okay, like what effect does that have on people? Okay, so we all have 4 psychological needs that when satisfied create intrinsic engagement. Okay, and that's our need for relatedness, autonomy, purpose, and mastery. Okay, and it's what makes games so intrinsically engaging and even addictive is because the 4 ingredients in games directly satisfy our 4 psychological needs. Okay, and so that's why we're even talking about games and gamification in the context of market research, because we want to satisfy people's psychological needs so that they can be intrinsically engaged in the process. And the way to do that is by using those 4 game ingredients and obviously using games and gamification. So when we see surveys with just some smiley faces, you're not getting to the point of gamification, right? You're not using gamification as a tool to get to the outcomes that it's used for, right? So I agree with you there, Dave, that, you know, just having some smiley faces is not gamification, but of course, you know, there is no doubt that there are, you know, many benefits to making surveys much more visual and, you know, interactive in that way. I mean, well, surveys are interactive by their very nature, right? But you see what I'm saying? Just kind of like making them more visual or maybe more aesthetically pleasing and things like that.
What if you have a chatbot that sort of, you know, stands in, whatever, for an interviewer and asks you questions? Is that gamification?
Well, again, you know, let's ask ourselves: are there goals, rules, feedback systems, and opportunities for autonomy? And crucially, you know, let's take a common sense approach. Do I feel like I'm playing a game? We all know what it feels like to be playful or when we're playing a game. And if the answer is no, then no, right? I mean, communicate with chatbots when I'm on my banking. When I do my online banking, I communicate with chatbots when I'm on a website and, maybe purchasing some household goods. And it might say, hey, is there anything else you need? Or did you find anything else you need? And yes, I'm communicating with the chatbot, but I certainly don't feel like I'm playing a game. It's very much when those game ingredients are happening and I feel like I'm playing. And I think for researchers who are interested in gamification and want to kind of understand the differences, right, between something that's gamified and non-gamified, I would thoroughly suggest kind of looking at as many gamification examples as you can, in and outside of research, because especially in the marketing industry, like going back to your background, Dave, there are tons of gamified marketing campaigns or even fully fledged games that are used as marketing tools. And these are called adver games, right? They are a whole genre onto themselves. And that's a great place to go to for inspiration. And just to share a couple of examples, and Dave, you'll know this because you're sitting there in Australian Surfers Paradise. There's a game called Dumb Ways to Die. And not a lot of people are fully aware that this game was actually to help promote safety on the Melbourne trains. And it was created by an advertising agency and has been a huge success. And apparently, according to many websites that talk about this as a marketing gamification case study, the near misses on the trains has been reduced by 33% just from people playing this game and making them more aware to kind of just be safe around trains. And the game even was so successful that the jingle itself has had like over 1 million hits on YouTube, like the jingle that comes with the game. So that's one example. There's other.
So actually, Betty, to give you an example, so I actually, in full disclosure, I work for the agency that came up with that. I didn't have anything to do with that particular campaign, but
well, there we are. Okay.
But it was so successful that the guys that actually did create that campaign now have major global positions in major agencies. So I guess it worked for them, right? Which is the most important thing. But to that point, the thing about Dumb Ways to Die was, yes, it was that point of messages, and I guess in the same way you were talking about, with a lot of survey work we do, things that people aren't really interested in. So unfortunately, people are not really interested in the fact that X number of people died by actually falling on train tracks. They don't care until that actually affects them. And so, what's interesting is gamifying something that actually has very, very little emotional quotient. So I'd be interested though, when you talk about examples like that, what's an example of that's easy to explain that you found in terms of a survey where somebody has done gamification in a really interesting way?
Well, I mean, I think, probably I can talk about our own work here at Research for Gaming in a more confident manner because I know the work so well. But and this kind of example goes back to your point, Dave, about having some emotion come to life, and I think that's really where our work stands out for our clients, because it's not just about making their research more intrinsically engaging and playful and making it into a game, but bringing the research content to life and creating an emotional connection for the participants. And one of my kind of most memorable case studies was one where we asked participants to imagine themselves living in the year 2030. Our client was, and it was on behalf of an academic study actually, so it was very much a social research project. The results were shared in governmental forums. There were, papers written up about the academic study, including the results from our research game. And, the research itself was asking participants to think about things that were very conceptual, like not just about the future, the year 2030, which in itself can be quite hard for anyone to just sort of wrap their heads around, but things like, what do you think you're going to use as kind of forms of identification in the future? Like, how do you think your laptop will know who you are, or your phone, or how do you think phones will evolve? Like, this is really, innovative, creative, conceptual stuff. And that kind of stuff was, for in our point of view, here at Research Through Gaming, we knew that we had an audience of 18 to 65 plus year olds. So the other challenge, of course, on top of that, was making this accessible and easy to understand and interesting, of course, for all of those age groups, right, for the UK public. And so we created this narrative where you woke up in the year, you're in the future, you're in the year 2030, but you actually live, in the present day, but somehow you've ended up in the future, and your time machine is broken down, and you need help. You need some help from people to fix it, so you can go kind of back to where you came from. So clearly I'm borrowing from the Back to the Future narrative here, right? And the only way you can convince those people that you're telling the truth, so that they can give you a hand, is by answering their questions about the future. And you also find yourself in these futuristic scenarios, and rather than asking you, what kind of things do you think you're going to wear, you can actually just pick clothes for your avatar to wear. So there's a lot more effort in the user experience, I think, when you're making a game for research. You can use lots of other elements of games to bring the emotion and the research content to life. So using avatars, using music and sound effects, even using virtual environments, using artificial intelligence to have conversations with characters rather than feeling like you're just being kind of asked questions incessantly and responding using grids and that kind of thing. And that example, we had so much engagement from that. I think that was one of the times that I read the data in the SPSS file and the verbatim responses from participants, and thought, wow, like this is really it, right? This is the methodology of the future, because we had participants who were 72 and 89 saying, I really enjoyed this. Please sign me up to do more research if it's like this in the future. And also people said that they had a learning experience, because, they're so immersed in this different world, right? They're also learning something, yeah. And our client was able to take the results from that to understand kind of, what are some of the desires and taboos around the future, what are people worried about, what are they excited about, and that research helped them share appropriate data with certain governmental institutions that funded their study in the US and here in the UK. But that's one example where the content is very conceptual. There's other surveys or research that we've made games from, like how do you imagine this new product from a soup company, or make your ideal kind of exercise pants, right? And we say to participants, pretend you're a designer for the day, and they go through different levels to kind of create like a basic product, whether it's fashion or food product, and then they level up from there. And so all the games that I make are tailor-made, but of course, there is so much scope for having like off-the-shelf games that are kind of templates that you can edit to, be more, I guess you can say, fitting to certain consumer groups or certain clients and things like that. But definitely that emotional quotient, as you mentioned, Dave, that's another layer where games, in my view, are so much more useful than surveys, because they are visual, because they are much more interactive. You can understand the why behind what people are saying and choosing to do, because you've got the context there. In a game, you've built that context. You can see what things and stimuli are driving people's behaviors and choices much more than you can do on like a traditional survey.
What about, you mentioned product design. I've seen examples in automotive research. I don't know if you would personally consider this gamification or not, but for example, people who are considering buying a car, whatever are knowledgeable, whatever the respondents' qualifications are, they're shown an automobile on the screen. And then, with all the specs, the shape, and, with virtual reality, they can sort of take a tour inside and kind of like sit in it and all that. And then they're asked, of course, standard questions: what do you like most about it? What do you like least about it? So forth and so on. And then asked to change. What about this would you change? And that could include actually through clicking and dragging, changing the shape of the car or the color or any of these kinds of things. Is that sort of thing catching on yet?
Well,
that sort of application?
Yeah, I mean, I know the kind of thing you're talking about, because of course Nike ID did this a few years ago, where you could make your own bespoke trainers or sneakers, as they're known in the US, and you could build them online in all the different colors you want, and you could buy them there and there. But that was more of a consumer product on the Nike website, as opposed to a piece of research where we're maybe trying to get an aggregate data of the most popular colors people are choosing, or textures, and that kind of thing. So yes, I know the exact kind of thing you're talking about. But I think if that was me doing that, I would want to introduce those game ingredients to maybe make that process have another kind of layer of engagement on that process. So I might kind of break it down into different levels. I might give rewards after completing each level. So maybe level 1 is kind of just getting the basic preferred shape of your car or food product or fashion product or whatever it is together, and then maybe the second level is doing more exciting things like thinking about color and textures, and then maybe the third level, we're starting to think about pricing and ecological factors and that kind of thing, but giving rewards after those levels, and so that you're introducing that kind of element of challenge that people find really interesting. So that's kind of maybe what I would do differently. But certainly there's no right or wrong, because I think the point of using what's called serious games and gamification is going back to your point earlier, making things that are maybe not fun or engaging already, trying to make those fun and engaging to do. So there's lots of things that we will focus on in our lives, and we don't need those additional stimuli.
Perhaps a better example would be a UX experience with your bank, with a bank, and then you're going here, and you don't have to make it too amusing, but taking people through various scenarios. Well, what if you want to do this? You're trying to transfer money, and this happens. How would you react? Okay.
Right.
And then you ask a question, and the answer comes back this: how would you react? Is that another area perhaps that you see growth opportunities for, whether or not you call it gamification?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any researcher listening to this podcast right now, I would say to them, the gamification of a piece of research or making it into a fully fledged game is kind of creating an architecture of intrinsic engagement and play around your question. So literally you can have any question, like the one that you just gave now, Kevin, as an example, or and it could be about any kind of research. Some people say to me, is it better for kind of FMCG products? Is it better for B2B? Gamification and games can be applied to any research content for any age group. And I think if you are somebody who has maybe an existing survey, or you're looking at a new piece of research with fresh eyes, there's really good guidelines in my book, and activities as well that you can do, which just make you think about, okay, what's the goal I'm going to give in my survey, or what is the feedback system, which can include rewards, right? What is the feedback system I'm going to employ? Are there rules? If so, what are they? And what are the kind of autonomy opportunities I can introduce. So as long as you've got those four great game ingredients at work in your survey, you can literally apply that to any kind of question for any kind of research. And that means that there's growth opportunities everywhere, right? So it's a really exciting time for researchers.
So I have two things, Betty, I'd like to just cover before we have to finish off. One is, over the years, I've seen some really good examples of using, I guess, existing marketplace games. For example, I've seen brands do things where they took a Monopoly and rebuilt Monopoly to have people playing Monopoly games, but instead of the streets and the banks you normally see, it was literally about the category. So it would be things like every street would be a different soft drink option, that sort of stuff. And then you would literally play Monopoly, and then it would sort of be, well, why did you buy that street versus that street, that sort of thing.
Sure.
I also was involved a few years ago when I was with a big ad agency, and we did a piece of work on privacy, and some genius in New York actually came up with an idea, and we developed basically it was a tarot card system. People, and it was tarot cards, but it was based around how people reacted it was all about privacy issues, but we used tarot cards. But the thing I wanted to ask you about was, we touched on the smiley faces before, and one of my big bugbears is the fact that we have a large and growing population of people who don't use written languages. They use emoji or visual icons for literacy. My simple example is my son, who's finishing his university undergrad degree, was actually asked to write an essay all in emoji at one stage. Right. And we have large populations. I live in Thailand. The number one social platform there is Line. 75% of the population uses Line every day. And most of those people have whole conversations going backward and forward in which no written words are used, only icons, iconography, emoji, etc. And so what's a good example of games you've seen where we're not actually asking any questions, we're just using those new forms of literacy, if you like?
There are countless games, games for entertainment, that do not have any written words on screen, and you instinctively know what to do in the game, because the game is built in such an intuitive way, and so much user experience research has gone into the game, and making games is very much a science. There are people employed by large and small game companies that work out the best user experience and accessibility, and even the kind of the sweet spot between making something too easy or too hard to do, and that's another reason why we should be using games in market research, because there are lots of people that find it maybe who are hard of hearing or hard of sight, and actually in a game, in a visual kind of simulation, if you like, they are able to respond to that in a much more intuitive way. And actually, I think that goes for everybody. Whether, every single human being on this earth, we are used to communicating and reacting to other people and stimuli in a human way. And that's what research games and gamifying surveys is trying to do. It's trying to bring essentially that qualitative element of real life in a digital environment, so that we can have these simulations of experiences, right? Because life is experiential. Why shouldn't research be experiential? And bring those simulations to life. Because when we have a traditional survey and we're asking people, what did you eat for breakfast yesterday? Or why did you buy this product? Or, oh, okay, you're saying that you will buy this product in the future. Where do you think you're going to buy it from? Or how much do you think you're going to spend? If you have the visuals there and the stimuli there like a game, in a visual way, it's a simulation, like I said earlier, you can see, you as the researcher can see the why, but more importantly for the participant, they're going to react in a much more human and natural manner, and be able to actually think more immersively about what's being asked, much more than like a white screen with grid boxes, because actually that's less human than the visuals that you're talking about, Dave, which is what we're used to every day. I mean, things, we started life by drawing on caves, right? And then then we've got languages where people are using hieroglyphics, and actually you could argue that we're going full circle, right? We're going back to those visual elements.
I mean, that's definitely the, we are reverting to our natural form of literacy, which is pictures.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I have a zillion questions to ask you, Betty, but unfortunately we're running short on time. I have a suspicion that Dave, however, has a question he would like to ask you.
Yeah, so
Sure.
Betty, I did warn you. There's a question I ask all our guests. It's at the final question, and it's quite simple, really, although the answers somewhat are varied. Given your experience and all the work you've done, what's the one question that you never asked that you wish you had?
To participants or to clients?
In a piece of research, whether to participants or clients or whatever. What's the one question that you didn't ask that you wish you had?
Oh God, that's a really good question. Oh, do you know what? That's quite a thinker, actually. I'm like, I don't want to be cocky and be like, well, there isn't, and I've asked all the questions that I need to ask, because I do like to think that I'm very transparent in that way with participants when I'm designing the games. Can I come back to you on that? Because I'm really...
Let me know. I've written a couple of answers. For you and for other people that are interested, if you go to Research World Connect, SMR's Research World Connect site, you'll find there's a couple of articles I've written about the answers we've received from this, from market research experts around the world. And it is a very interesting response and varied. So go have a look at that, think about it, and maybe in the future, you and I can figure out how I can gamify that in some way. Think about
that. I have thought of an answer, actually, if we have a sec. I will say, now, I always add on a question at the end of our research games, just, like, what did any other additional comments, put them here, whether it's about what the research is about or about the research game itself. But would you like to play a research game again? So I kind of tack on those questions at the end of our games. But I would like to ask, would you be willing to be involved in co-designing a research game in the future? And asking that to participants, just to kind of get a measure of how into it they are. Because, a sign of intrinsic engagement is taking on voluntary tasks.
Right. Interesting answer, because as you said it, my first thought was, that's probably a very, very good idea, because I could imagine that with traditional, particularly surveys, if you ask people, would you like to be involved in the development of a traditional survey? Oh God, no, please shoot me, would probably be the answer.
Yeah, but asking them if you want to be involved, and maybe, from a participant's point of view, what could be made better? That's the question. Actually, you're making me think I should now ask that from now on. So thank you, Dave.
Please go ahead.
Well, we owe it to you. You've educated us so much. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope the weather improves during the course of the day.
Thank you both for having me. This has been great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Betty.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.